This is Afrique Vibe News. Welcome to Afrique Vibe News, where we bring you powerful stories shaping Africa's future, from bold leadership and independence movements to groundbreaking defense and development strategies. Today, we dive deep into one of the most revolutionary projects in African military history. In a time when the continent has been carved by colonial borders, constrained by donor-funded peacekeeping missions, and often silenced in global security conversations, three West African countries have decided enough is enough. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger are building a unified military force, an army that answers only to their people, not to Paris, Washington, or Brussels. This isn't just news. It's a historic pivot, a deliberate break from decades of dependency, manipulation, and military failure engineered from abroad. But to understand the scale of this movement, we must first go way back. Africa's armies, particularly in West and Central Africa, were never built to protect Africans. The foundation of most military institutions on the continent was laid by European colonialists, not to defend African sovereignty, but to suppress resistance and maintain foreign rule. In French West Africa, military service was compulsory for African men, but they weren't defending their villages. They were sent to die in Europe's wars. They wore foreign uniforms, took orders in foreign tongues, and learned to fire weapons not for liberation, but for colonization. After independence, these structures remained. Most African armies didn't undergo serious reform. Colonial command, hierarchies, French doctrines, European ranks, and external dependency continued, and so, when insurgencies began to rise, first sporadically, then rapidly, most African militaries found themselves ill-equipped, poorly trained, and dependent on foreign partners to handle the growing chaos. Nowhere has this crisis played out more violently than in the Sahel, a vast, arid belt stretching across the width of the continent, plagued by jihadist militancy, climate shocks, and crumbling governance. Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso have endured years of spiraling insecurity. From remote villages to major towns, entire regions have fallen outside government control. Foreign actors poured in with promises of help. France launched Operation Barkhane, the UN deployed MINUSMA peacekeepers, the US established drone bases, and billions in military aid flowed into the region. But despite all this, things got worse. Local communities witnessed a chilling pattern. The more foreign soldiers arrived, the more territory was lost, and the more civilians died. Armed groups adapted quickly. They learned the terrain, moved through forests and deserts, struck at will, and melted away. Foreign forces were slow, bureaucratic, and disconnected from the ground reality. Reports emerged of delayed air support, poor intelligence, and minimal engagement. Rules that left UN patrols sitting ducks in volatile areas. In some cases, foreign troops were even accused of negotiating local ceasefires with insurgents, allowing them to shift operations across borders in exchange for reduced pressure in select zones. These weren't peace deals. They were tactical compromises, quiet betrayals. The reality became impossible to ignore. African soldiers were dying while foreign advisors watched. Villages were abandoned, roads turned to war zones, and hope evaporated. And yet, when African governments begged for real assistance, they were handed consultants and lectures. This is the environment in which the new wave of leadership emerged. In Mali, Colonel Assimi Goïta took power after 2 military coups in less than a year. In Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the world's youngest head of state, stepped in amid a devastating security collapse. And in Niger, General Abdourahmane Tiani overthrew a Western-aligned government after years of ineffective defense policy. To Western capitals, these were power-hungry soldiers. But to many in the Sahel, they were the only leaders willing to confront the truth. The war was being lost because it was being fought on someone else's terms. In the barracks and command posts of these three countries, a new idea was taking shape: an African solution for African security, one that didn't depend on Paris, Washington, or the UN Security Council. In a closed-door meeting in Bamako, no press, no translators, no staged handshakes, the defense ministers of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger signed a groundbreaking agreement. They weren't forming a joint task force. They weren't setting up another standby unit. They were building a new army, a real continental force with shared command, joint doctrine, and borderless operation. The alliance of Sahel states, AES, was more than a diplomatic bloc. It was a military confederation with teeth. Key components of the agreement included cross-border deployment authority. Soldiers from any AES member could operate in another without needing foreign clearance. Joint command structure, a rotating high command across member states to ensure equal leadership. And operational unity, new military doctrine, developed from scratch, not inherited from France or the US, but based on terrain warfare, insurgency response, and asymmetric strategies unique to the Sahel. Shared logistics, fuel, ammunition, and food would move seamlessly along military corridors reinforced by rail and road upgrades. Sovereign procurement, weapons and drones would no longer come with Western strings attached. Instead, AES leaders began forging new supply chains with countries like Russia, Iran, Turkey, and China. Even more radical was the ideological framework of this army. This wasn't a ceremonial force for national parades. It was designed to be a people's army, integrated with local communities and accountable to citizens, not to donors. Western-aligned African armies are often hobbled by bureaucracy, corruption, and over-reliance on advisors who don't understand local realities. Even the African Union's standby brigades have been criticized for their slow response and lack of cohesion, but the AES is being built differently. It is governed by urgency and necessity, not theory. Instead of outsourcing training, they're establishing their own academies. Instead of copying outdated colonial doctrines, they're writing new ones designed for terrain-based counterinsurgency, low-resource operations, and extreme mobility. And most importantly, the AES military project is fundamentally political. It's a rejection of dependence, a statement that Africa doesn't need to be managed, babysat, or pacified. It can build, lead, and defend itself on its own terms. When Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger decided to unify their defense strategy, they knew they were starting with broken pieces. These weren't countries flush with military budgets. These were nations emerging from coups, scarred by years of conflict, and exhausted by dependency on unreliable foreign support. What they had was not polished arsenals but scattered troops, fractured doctrines, and a burning determination to never again rely on outsiders. They also had one crucial asset: full control of their land. With foreign bases being closed, diplomatic ties with former colonizers severed, and influence from Western defense contractors removed, these nations could finally rethink everything from how soldiers are trained to how wars are fought. They didn't just want an army, they wanted a new military identity. In most African armies, military doctrine is inherited. France trains one, the US trains another. A British doctrine here, a UN peacekeeping manual there. The result: total disunity and no operational cohesion. Mali's army leaned heavily on French training manuals. Niger's command structure followed American counterinsurgency strategy. Burkina Faso's armed forces had been patchworked by successive governments and military partners. So the AES made a bold decision: throw it all away, start from scratch. In the second Bamako summit, military leaders and strategists came together to create something unheard of in modern African defense: a joint combat doctrine, not just a shared mission statement, but a tactical guide built from the ground up to reflect the terrain of the Sahel, from Mali's rocky highlands to Burkina Faso's savanna to Niger's desert plains. The enemy's mobility fast, decentralized insurgents using motorcycles, human intelligence networks, and drones. The limitations: low-tech gear, budget constraints, and no real-time foreign intel. The strengths: local knowledge, historical, warrior traditions, and a high degree of community loyalty. The doctrine emphasized joint patrols, mixed battalions across countries operating as one unit. Asymmetrical warfare training, focused on light, fast movement, not armored parades. Decentralized command, units trained to act with independence, not wait for centralized orders. Cultural fluency, commanders would learn local languages, customs, and terrain, something no Western general could replicate. Instead of sending officers to Sandhurst, Paris, or Fort Benning, the AES opted to build its own training institutions. The first AES combat school is already under development on reclaimed military land in northern Burkina Faso, an area previously devastated by insurgent control. Now, it will become the beating heart of a new security doctrine. These institutions will not only teach tactics, They'll instill a shared identity, ensuring that a recruit from Mali can fight seamlessly beside a Burkina or Nigerian comrade. From uniforms to insignias, language of command to operational drills, unity is being hard-coded into the DNA of the force. Recruits are trained in local environments, not sanitized military bases, but actual forests, deserts, and riverine zones where combat happens. But more importantly, these academies aim to reorient the African soldier's role. No longer enforcers of political power or tools of foreign strategy, they are trained as defenders of the people, answering not just to their state, but to their communities, unlike ACOWs or standby forces, which are often paralyzed by bureaucratic turf wars and unclear command chains. The AES is instituting a rotating high command system. Here's how it works. Every year, one member country hosts the strategic headquarters. That country appoints a supreme joint commander. Officers from other countries relocate to serve under that command, rotating through new terrains, command cultures, and languages. This is not just symbolic. It's a forced integration system designed to tear down national silos, build trust, and eliminate friction between the member states. Think of it as military exchange with a purpose. Within just a few years, the AES expects to have hundreds of officers with cross-border leadership experience, something unheard of in most African defense systems. This makes the AES not just interoperable, but resilient. If one command structure is taken out, another can immediately take over. That's battlefield survivability, something foreign trained forces often lack. One of the most revolutionary steps in the AES security architecture is the creation of an independent communications and command network. The AES grid, Western defense systems rely on satellite coordination, cloud-based intelligence sharing, and foreign-operated logistics chains. This creates dependency and vulnerability. So the AES is developing a secure digital infrastructure, reportedly with help from engineers from Algeria, Iran, and even North Korea. This grid includes encrypted field radios immune to interception by Western SIGINT, ground-based data hubs that function under satellite blackout conditions, secure routing lines for command messages, movement orders, and surveillance data. This makes AES one of the few African military bodies capable of operating fully offline, without foreign surveillance or data monitoring. It's not just about privacy, it's about sovereignty, logistics, supply and arms. Breaking away from Western chains, no army survives on tactics alone. It needs fuel, food, weapons, uniforms, and transportation. Traditionally, African countries have imported their defense needs via Western-approved logistics chains, often tied to conditions like loan repayments, election compliance, or diplomatic concessions. The AES has declared this over. At the Bamako coordination meeting, defense ministers designated military corridors across the Sahel road and rail lines that would be upgraded, guarded, and prioritized for troop and equipment movement. They're also cutting out old suppliers. Instead of relying on US or European vendors, AES procurement teams are signing contracts with Russia for light arms, armored vehicles, and military trainers, Iran for drone technology, anti-insurgency kits, and digital jamming tools, China for logistics vehicles, surveillance equipment, and communication gear, Turkey for light UAVs, paramilitary protective gear, and mobile command bases. Even more ambitious, the AES is planning a joint arms production zone, ammunition factories in eastern Burkina Faso, drone assembly lines in Niger, combat vehicle repair depots in Mali. This is about long-term sustainability. No more begging for bullets or waiting for spare parts. Africa is beginning to arm itself. The most radical difference between the AES and past African military efforts isn't just in hardware, it's in philosophy. The AES army is not being built as a shield for governments. It's being built as a weapon of the people. In Mali, traditional hunter guilds, the Dozo, long protectors of rural areas, are being formally integrated into the paramilitary patrol framework. In Burkina Faso, civilian watch groups are receiving training to work with the AES on intel collection and logistics. In Niger, tribal elders and community leaders are being embedded into recruitment planning to ensure fair representation and local trust. This isn't about creating militias. It's about ensuring the army grows out of the local soil, not imposed from above. Unlike ACOWs or standby brigades that appear during crises and disappear after summits, the AES army is becoming permanent, rooted, and emotionally connected to the people it protects, and that makes it dangerously effective because a soldier who fights for paycheck follows orders. But a soldier who fights for his village never quits. What began as a defense meeting in Bamako is now sending tremors across the globe, because when Africa builds an army, a real army without Western supervision, without NATO coordination, and without IMF signatures, the world pays attention, not because of what the army is, but because of what it represents. This isn't just a military, it's a rejection of an old order. For decades, African militaries were structured to serve as security extensions of the global north. They received funding from France, training from the US, and intelligence from NATO satellites. In exchange, they offered stability on someone else's terms. But what if African nations begin saying no to permanent foreign bases, no to security dependence, no to the idea that African defense must be outsourced? This is why the AES project has been met with silence from Paris, discomfort in Brussels, and panic in Washington. On paper, the West has said little. No formal condemnations, no emergency press conferences. But behind closed doors, intelligence agencies, foreign ministries, and think tanks are scrambling. Here's why. France has lost permanent troop presence in Mali and Burkina Faso. Its influence over the region is collapsing. The US, which built over 6 drone and surveillance installations in Niger alone, is watching its entire Sahel surveillance network become irrelevant. The EU is struggling to maintain migration and anti-trafficking agreements signed with previous governments. These powers are not just losing military leverage, they are losing ideological control. There are whispers already, media leaks, anonymous officials claiming the AES is being influenced by Russia and Iran, or that China is militarizing the Sahel for its Belt and Road strategy. But that's not the real fear. The real fear is this: what if it works? What if an African army, built without foreign hands, is not only functional but effective? What if it brings real security to rural zones, stops terrorism, and wins battles that foreign troops never could? And more terrifyingly, what if other African countries follow? Guinea, Chad, Togo, the Central African Republic, even nations within ECOWAS and the O might begin to wonder if the Sahel can do it. Why not us? This is how power breaks. Not with tanks, but with ideas. To understand why the AES model is revolutionary, we have to revisit a basic question. Who does the African soldier serve? For too long, the answer was the government, the donor, the advisor. The soldier enforced stability, yes, but often for the benefit of foreign interests, not the people. In the AES model, that question has been redefined. The African soldier is being trained to serve his people, his land, his history. In other words, sovereignty comes first. Power is not outsourced. Decisions are not negotiated in hotel rooms abroad. For the first time in modern African history, a regional army is saying, we don't need to be watched, guided, and funded. We can fight our own battles. This shift is ideological, but also practical. Instead of serving to maintain a status quo designed in Washington or Paris, soldiers now fight to defend a future defined by their own people. That's not just national defense, that's national rebirth. The rise of the AES poses an existential threat not just to foreign military power, but to the very structure of African geopolitics. Take ECOWAS, for example. For years, ECOWAS was considered the central hub for West African diplomacy, conflict resolution, and economic integration. But ECOWAS has been increasingly seen, especially by AES states, as a proxy for Western power. After the coups in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, ECOWAS imposed sanctions, threatened military intervention, suspended memberships. Yet at no point did ECOWAS address why these coups happened. No dialogue, no compromise, just punishment. That's why AES leaders refer to their alliance not as a union, but a confederation, one based on equal standing, mutual respect, and self-defense. There's a real possibility now that West Africa could split into two blocks, one under the ECOWAS France EU, NATO umbrella, one under the AES, aligned with non-Western partners, and internal doctrines that divide could shape everything: diplomacy, trade, defense, migration, and digital infrastructure. The scramble for Africa is no longer about who owns the mines or builds the railways, it's about who controls the rules and AES wants to write its own. Ideas are powerful. But in war, ideas are only as strong as the boots on the ground. The AES hasn't yet faced its full trial by fire. Joint patrols are underway, training programs are expanding. Local communities are integrating into defense plans, but the real test will come when the AES army faces a multi-front insurgent attack, a coordinated terrorist offensive, an internal security breakdown, a crisis that tests both loyalty and capacity. Will soldiers from Burkina Faso fight in Niger without hesitation? Will commanders obey orders from a high command located in another country? Will local populations accept AES troops as liberators, not occupiers? The answers to these questions will determine whether the AES becomes Africa's first independent military success story or just another Pan-African dream cut short by politics and ego. But one thing is certain, the old model is broken. The West had its chance, it failed, and now a new vision is rising. For too long, Africa was told it needed permission to defend itself, permission to build armies, permission to buy weapons, permission to fight wars on its own soil. But now Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have shown the continent a different path, a path of defense without dependency. They've proven that unity is not a slogan, it's a strategy. That sovereignty is not a theory, it's a plan. And that the African soldier is not a proxy. He is a protector. The AES army is still young, its future is uncertain. But its message is already loud and clear. Africa will no longer wait, not for funding, not for peacekeepers, not for approval. If the continent is to be secure, it must secure itself. If it is to be free, it must defend its freedom with its own hands. And if it is to rise, it must do so on its own terms, because in the Sahel, a new Africa is being born, not in boardrooms, but in barracks. Not in treaties, but in trenches. And this time, the world is not invited to lead, it can only watch or follow. Thank you for watching Afric Vibe News. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more in-depth stories on African development, resistance, and sovereignty. Turn on notifications so you never miss an episode.